welcome everybody. My name is Francis Voorhees, and I'm the director of the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch University. And I'm also serve as the academic director of the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University in Rwanda. Welcome to our session. It's session 10. It's fabulous you're all with us. It's a challenge, as we saw yesterday, to stay on Zoom, but we're doing it, and it presents great opportunities for us to bring lots of people together as we're doing in this session. But before I get going with the session, there's a few announcements I have to give to you, and our colleague Dominic was going to run a short video. So let me go through the announcements for a couple minutes, and then I'll come back and introduce our panelists. So, welcome to day 3 and session 2 of the Conservation Symposium. A reminder that there will be awards for the best presentation and the best presentation by a young scientist, as voted by you, the delegates. There will also be a prize for the most the most active adjudicator, judging of presentation via our polls, and these will be during the last session on Friday. So I guess our group can qualify for best presentation, but maybe not for the best young scientist. Sorry, we're a bit older. Polls will be launched between presentations, and there have been 3 questions to be rated on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree, worst, to strongly agree, best. You have a maximum of 30 seconds to be ready to answer them. Keynote presentation will not be included in the judging. Questions for the speakers should be posted in the Q&A, and they can be upvoted and commented on by the other delegates. So for those of you who are used to chat, we're going to be using Q&A in this session, which is another button at the bottom of your screen rather than chat. So give it a try. It's a different approach, and our panelists can also engage in the Q&A. If you haven't done so yet, visit the virtual facts under 2021 program on the website and watch the short how-to videos to enhance your experience of the Conservation Symposium 2021. In addition, of course, to the Zoom sessions, the website itself has full of information on where to make contacts with other people. Please visit the discussions and networking parts of the website in particular and comment on subjects in the hot topics section, and also look at opportunities in the collaboration section. Please post and follow the Conservation Symposium on your favorite social media platforms. It's very important to try and get the word out of all the great discussions going on, so use your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn accounts, and use the hashtag Conservation Symposium 2021. You're also encouraged to submit via email to the Secretariat a short video clip of yourself, 30 seconds max, or a single slide, image, mem, or a text, sharing your positive experiences around conservation and hope for the future. These will be compiled along with snapshots from during the symposium itself and played just before the closing ceremony on day 5 and immortalized on YouTube. We are excited to hear your messages and to spread some much-needed hope and inspiration. And finally, Dominic, you're up now. Before the session starts, we invite you to watch this short video on an important conservation initiative and opportunity. So over to you, Dominic, to run the video. I hope. There we go.
Have you ever wished that you had eyes in the sky to survey a reserve or do a census? Or relocate animals quickly and safely over a long distance? Perhaps you need to assess damage to, or rehabilitation of a wetlands area. An environmental air force of skilled pilots, known as the Battaliers, share your passion for conservation. They use their skills and aircraft to help you, the conservation experts of Southern Africa.
My message to the people out there would be, utilize this resource and this opportunity to strengthen the kind of work that we do in conservation.
We've a number of missions in terms of our Operation Oxpecker, where you were instrumental in translocating batches of red-billed oxpeckers. In 2015, the red-billed oxpecker was delisted as a threatened species and removed in any sense, and it was declassified to least concern as a species in South Africa. That pack basically doubled in size in the first year that they were there. That just gives you an indication. Again, it's your intervention, your support that made that possible.
I think we work for the bats because the work is deeply satisfying, and perhaps most importantly, we can do so much with so little. The amount we can do with donors' funds is quite a remarkable story, and it's a story about an efficient organization, a very lean organization, and an incredibly generous group of pilots.
Oh, all right. I'll say it again. I said that was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous stuff. And my next instruction is to launch into the session. So here we go. So we've got 4 speakers with us from different parts of the country. Let me first just introduce them to you, and then I'll set the context of the discussion. So we've got Nonkabela Mayatula, who's in the wildlife economy as a business person. She runs a wildlife estate called Mira Estate in the Eastern Cape. She's also a board member of the Wildlife Ranching South Africa organization, and she's been the chair of the Wildlife Industry Transformation Forum for the Eastern Cape. So she's very, very active in this topic in South Africa. But as you'll see when I make some comments, we wanted to take the discussion a bit broader, so the other 3 folks come from other parts of the continent. Next, Angus Middleton, who's based in Namibia these days, is the executive director of the Namibia Nature Foundation, but has also been involved with the Federation of Associations for Hunting and Conservation of the EU as their Secretary General, longtime experienced person in this field of the wildlife economy. And then we have Dr. Victor Maposhi, who's from Zimbabwe, but has recently moved to Botswana. And he's a lecturer at the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University, and also a research fellow with us at the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch. And finally, a bit further north, we have Daudi Sumba, who's up in Kenya, actually talking to us from the shores of Lake Victoria, who's recently taken on a really exciting position with the Nature Conservancy and as a senior advisor of an investment program that they're involved with in rebuilding the sector after COVID, and also has been a wildlife economics consultant with the School of Wildlife Conservation with the studies that have been undertaken recently on the state of the wildlife economy across the continent. So we have on the panel then South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. Why broaden it out? Because the topic actually comes from some reports that came out of South Africa and proposals earlier this year, but they're actually much bigger than these reports in the country of South Africa. And what I'm referring to is the recent high-level panel report that came out of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and Environment, looking at a number of iconic species, at leopards, at elephants, the 2 species of rhinos, and at lion, and sort of asking, how do we manage these? What do we do about these species around topics like can lion hunting, rhino horn trade, and what have you? But what was very interesting in the paper is that it wasn't it didn't just focus on individual species. The panel got into much bigger issues of the systemic challenges that we face, socio-economic, environmental, the role of communities, the issue of transformation, of course, the issue of South Africa's position and its internationally and its position to be able to attract customers for tourism, for hunting, what have you, into the country, issues of welfare for people, welfare for wildlife, and so on. So the report actually looked at these species in a much broader context of basically what are the values behind the way in which we manage wildlife, and in that context, how do the values generated from a wildlife economy support those values or relate to those values? Following that, the department, DFFE, released a draft policy position where they're trying to now take the report and move it into some policies with respect to the species, but also these broader systemic issues. And so we looked at it and said, well, this wildlife economy, where is it coming from? How does it relate to people's views about livelihoods, about landscapes, about climate resilience, about wildlife itself? It's not just a South African issue. So we thought we would have a discussion with you today with folks that would bring in perspectives from around the continent. And here we have South Africa with Nokabela, Angus with Namibia, but not limited to talking about Namibia, of course, Victor from Zimbabwe, and Dowdy from Kenya. But of course, all of our panelists can speak more broadly than the countries they're from, but to look at this whole topic from a sort of African-wide perspective of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities for the wildlife economy, for growing it, for meeting our objectives of landscape restoration, of climate resilience, of local livelihoods, of empowerment, inclusivity, and of course of conserving wildlife populations. So the way we're going to do it is I'll start with Nokambela and ask her to give a few comments from her perspective. No PowerPoint presentations, no more video clips, and she'll go for whatever 5-10 minutes, and then we'll go on with all four of our panelists. You can throw some questions in the Q&A for them as we go along, and then I've also got some questions to fill in too. So we'll start with four presentations and then move it into a discussion with everybody on the call. And by the way, thanks everybody for showing up. Let's hope, touch wood, that we don't get load shedding and disappear soon. Nokabela, over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I feel I'm in the presence of greatness with all the brain power that I'm on the platform with. From a South African perspective, I will start to point out just a few key parameters that we should work with as we discuss the aspects of the conversation. Out of 122 million hectares in South Africa, 20 million are in the hands of private game farmers. And an additional 10 million hectares has been earmarked for game farming through what we call the land reform initiatives. Now, having said that, an anomaly exists, and I will use myself and say being Black, female, and owning a farm, let alone a game farm, is not a common occurrence. Now, this point speaks to the baseline or potential for transformation, inclusivity elements, and all the other things that we think wildlife could enable. The second point I want to speak to is that of ownership of land, which is viewed as an enabler, which means beyond the 10 million hectares, the rest should be purchased. The recent research paper on land use management model for private wildlife that was commissioned by the National Research Foundation in WRSA suggests the following. In the past 5 years, a lot of, or the bigger block of game farmers owners invested about 30 million on land, about 8 million on infrastructure. And in addition to that, they would then have to finance the acquisition of the game, support the hunting infrastructure that is required, management, marketing, and so on and so forth. Just to give you a picture of the finances that go into it. And the income then that would be derived from it is sort of skewed, not in the same proportion as the investment, with hunting providing 25%, ecotourism 6%. And then we park that. The second or third point is our constitution in South Africa, which deals with Section 24 specifically, the sustainable use of wildlife as a right or not. And this is concurrent with the other rights, including cultural property rights issue. And the point I want to put on the table is, should these property rights be meddled with? What does it mean from investment and attraction or willingness to participate in the space? Uncertainty. And then just below the constitution, we have our legislation and mandates. We've got 9 provinces that regulate the sector, and that is overarched by the Department of Environmental, Fisheries and Forestry, and Department of Land Affairs. So that's 2 national departments and the province, the legislation that goes with that. Best efforts to cooperate as far as governance is concerned have sort of come short. Another point that I just want to table is the cost of inclusive economy. The way I see just society, there are 3 parties, I always say. There's the government, which is the regulator, and you've got business, which sorts to make investments and returns, and you've got civil society. And what government does, if you look at it in the form of a prism, is try and regulate to balance these 2 competing objectives. The important thing for me for the subject is the role of each one of these pillars, because it is important. And my view is that government should regulate. It often becomes problematic when government is a regulator and a player at the same time. And the second one is for investors, for business to play in that space. It needs a little bit of more certainty, and the rules of engagement should be clear, and it should be profitable. And then you have civil society, which includes your communities where most of these activities occur. And the question is, what is the role of these communities? Should they be merely beneficiaries? Should they be participants? How do the benefits that are derived from business flow to them? And the answer to that depends on these building blocks that I have set forth. The overarching question, given COVID and where we are now, is, and I speak from a tourism point of view primarily, is that overall, South Africa has got the highest unemployment rates as a result of COVID, or exacerbated by COVID. And tourism has been the hardest hit. And forget anything that would have had anything to do with hunting. So that's the framework within which I would like to couch my responses to you, Frank, and the participants and my colleagues here. Thank you.
Let me unmute, otherwise you'll never hear me. Thank you very much, Nkabela. That's very, very interesting. So you've put it into 3 big groups: business, civil society, and the government. And one of the points that you brought up that I think is worth really thinking about is who's regulating and who's playing, and who's benefiting. And so in a way, you said your position as the government should be on the regulation side, not the playing side. The business are the players, and the communities we have to discuss. Are they players? Are they beneficiaries? Or even are they regulators, which you didn't mention? But there's that's a very interesting point. And one of the things that came out of the high-level panel report was a discussion on the protected area system, sand parks, etc., to say to what extent should the state be both a player in those landscapes and a regulator in those landscapes. And I don't think it's been resolved yet, but it's certainly there. Plus, then you brought up the importance of ownership of land and ownership of the resources and so on. So let's hold it for there. And folks, if you've got questions, put them into the questions, and we'll come back to them. And let's move over to Angus. We've lost Dowdy, but I hope we'll find him back before he comes on. And so we'll just head up a little bit north from the Eastern Cape into Namibia and ask Angus to speak on the topic from his perspective.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks very much for the invite. Equally, I feel a bit daunted by the brains on the panel. Mine are somewhat fried, and I did study economics a while ago. Regrettably, I don't use it enough, so also my apology to all the real economists that might be in the room. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and I'm going to zoom out slightly to reflect on how we arrived where we are today discussing the wildlife economy, because I would imagine that a good number of the participants, and I'm glad to see that we're well over 100 now, participants here, that most of them are not economists, and perhaps some of them are like me and dabble a little bit. So we should reflect that at the moment there's COP26 going on, and 2 weeks ago, I think it was around about 2 weeks ago, the first part of a now truncated CBD COP15 took place. Both were signed into force at the same time, emanating from Rio and signed in 1993. And already the numbers alone tell you the importance that we're weighing on these two processes. I do not want to, by any means, denigrate what's happening at COP26. I rather want to lament the fact that CBD is only on COP15 and has not hit the headlines at all. And yet we're discussing the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Embedded in that framework is the sustainable utilization of wildlife, in fact, of all living resources. And whilst COP26 is dealing with the symptoms, in fact, COP15 is dealing with the basis of life. So we should all just reflect on that, and I'm very glad that we are here discussing actually the basis of life, the wildlife economy. And essentially our discussion is about biodiversity as a market failure, and this is an African response to that market failure where biodiversity hasn't been properly captured. So I have to applaud the African Wildlife Economy Institute in bringing together these discussions. There's been a series of them, and I think that you're doing a great job, and I hope that there'll be many more. So if we step back a bit, and I'm going to unpack these as quickly as I can, I'd argue that implicit in the term wildlife economy discussion are two key factors. The first is that all of our economic activity is embedded in nature, and this comes out of what some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have heard of, the Dasgupta report. Most people have heard of the Stern report, which deals with climate change, and if they haven't heard of it, they've certainly seen the numbers that come out of it. Very few people heard of Pavan Sukhdev, a few more heard of the Teeb report, and probably not very many have heard of the Dasgupta report. It's very, very groundbreaking. I encourage you to have a look at it. So our economic activity is embedded in nature, but more importantly, there's a higher degree of non-substitutability of wild living resources than we think. We cannot simply substitute them for other forms of capital. So if we take, at the simplest level, let's take a cow and a kudu. We cannot substitute them simply on the basis of protein. There are other embedded factors that go into that, not least the fact that a cow is predominantly a grazer and a kudu is predominantly a browser. Secondly, we have to accept that there are planetary boundaries. The Club of Rome set us off on the wrong path and actually sowed the roots for us to start thinking that we can overcome our problems through technological advances, which, yes, that worked for non-renewable resources, but it doesn't work for the basis of life. And in those limits to growth, there is a ray of light in that with the right construct, greater net human well-being can be sustained for a much longer term through a nature-based economic system. So very briefly, if we unbundle the terms economics and wildlife, economics at its simplest level is concerned with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. It studies how individuals, businesses, governments, whoever make choices around those. What mainstream economics doesn't do is look at the embedded nature of those resources. How were they produced and how they're distributed? And this is our challenge. We have tools. We have a lot of tools to deal with them. But mainstream economics, and I've outlined those factors. We're looking at things like COP26 versus CBD 15. We're looking at Stern report versus Pavan Sukhdev's TEEB reports and Dasgupta reports, mainstream economics is not taking those into account. When Dasgupta was asked what would the first thing you would change, he said, my fellow economists. That was his first answer to the review. And it sort of underlines that. So we've seen this progress, but there are tools, and this discussion we're having around the wildlife economy leads us to understand that there are tools. But we still have these issues that are embedded in there. The economy itself, we tend to think of three types of economy: market economy, which is which is best understood in the free market capitalism, but that contains elements where there's not enough price signals are incorrect in that they don't contain the embedded nature of the goods, and there's no such thing as a rational being. People are not rational and they're not well informed, so they don't make the right choices. Command economy, we've seen the failures of command economies in terms of communism. So what most people start to go for is these mixed economies where government has a role, and Nkumbela started to unpack some of that in the discussion with South Africa. What we don't talk about is the fourth type of economy, the traditional economy. In the traditional economy, one of the key elements is the social capital. And notwithstanding many challenges in traditional economies, they tend to experience high levels of social satisfaction. So that's something that in our understanding of a mixed economy, we need to grab onto. Wildlife, we need to be more encompassing in the term wildlife. We tend to, and I'm encouraged that at least the high-level panel report in South Africa started to unbundle the less iconic aspects, the more complex aspects, but we need to do more around that. The Leadership University has released a report as well, where they take wildlife in a more encompassing term. So both wildlife and its natural landscapes, which also includes ecosystem services and links to livelihoods. But what do we understand by livelihoods? This is a very loaded term. At its root, it's considered a way and means of making a living in the world. And from that, and we tend to understand that at the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so at a very basic level. From that, further definitions have gone on to say that livelihoods are expressed as the ability to cope and recover from unexpected events, whilst at the same time enhancing current and future capabilities. So this brings in a living component and an element of resistance that separates it out from subsistence. There's other terms that go on looking at the social capital and expressing it as resources that are necessary to pursue one's livelihood, established through networks, etc. But in development in Africa in general, and I'll ask you all to reflect on the projects that you run, livelihood values tend to be assigned very basic. They're very constrained, shall we say. And local, and let's be frank about this, in Africa, when we say local, we're saying predominantly, if not entirely, local Black communities are assigned livelihood values that only encompass somehow physically utilizing, bartering, or selling, but please, not commercially, natural resources. Seldom are they ever afforded any amenity value. And we have a few placatory words here and there, and the social safeguards or something about culture, but very seldom is if ever, is recreational, well-being, sense of fulfillment, meaning, are those elements captured in our development aid. And yet these are the very values that help drive conservation, for good and sometimes bad, in developed countries, either by contributing towards conservation or removing and lowering barriers to conservation. So if we think, say, of recreational angling, hunting, hiking, and other deeper, more spiritual connections, those are allowed in Western and developed countries, but we don't see them being expressed in developing countries. So there's a whole conundrum that we're trying to deal with here. Anyway, I'll leave it there. We can unpack some of those things a bit further with the wildlife economy. Some numbers for Namibia very briefly. Over 40% of the land is under some form of conservation. In 2018, we did some studies that we know are an undervaluation. Ecosystem services, well in excess of 13 billion Namibian dollars. The highest of those, nature-based tourism, 5.2 billion. Interestingly, the distribution of that, 23% private land, 35% communal areas, 42% national parks. The majority, however, are provisioning services, with the next highest contributor being fodder for livestock, trophy hunting, which is a small but lucrative section of the hunting market and not including meat and other byproducts, contributed around $500 million. Almost half of that, trophy fees alone, 200 million. Communal areas counted for only 3.6% of visiting hunters, but over 7.5% of the revenue. So communal areas getting more buck for their bang. Interestingly, game meat provides marginally more than 111 million, but inland fisheries, which is focused in the northeast of Namibia, 110 million directly to communities. So inland fisheries are, in terms of communal land benefits, are almost 5 times more valuable than game meat, yet we focus more on iconic wildlife. I can go on for some of the other aspects. The issue that we're all facing is obviously been the crunch on tourism and hunting. And we know that in Namibia in 2020, over 70% of operators reported a drop of bookings to less than 10% of their average, and over 90% to less than 50% of their average. And this was in a period where there were strong drives and heavy discounts to attract local tourists. The future is open.
Thank you, Agnes. Very, very interesting comments. Very, very insightful. Economists originally talked about land, labor, and capital as the 3 factors of production. And in the early days of Adam Smith up in Glasgow and what have you, we had, I think, Dowdy's coming back. Good. Welcome back, Dowdy. In the early days of Adam Smith, who was based in Glasgow, of all places, he took land as sort of a free resource, and the constraint was labor. There wasn't enough workers, and he looked at the development of economies in Southern Africa and on the east coast of North America in those days and said, well, we've got a labor shortage. Well, today now we've got plenty of us, but land is a constraint. And I would say that one of the challenges has been economics in its DNA never looked at the resource constraint as well as it should. And what you brought out is really important, is the resource constraints that we have to look at with respect to landscapes and wildlife and so on. Your hands up, Angus.
Yeah, so it's only partially that land is the constraint. Actually, its productivity is the constraint.
Yeah, the productivity of the land.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly, and what you can do with it. So what we've got now linking, and then a comment on the big international policy. In some ways, whether we've had 15 COPs or 26 COPs or 200 COPs, the challenge we have with international policy is that they're great at talking about it, but the implementation is lacking in all these, as we've even see going on in Glasgow right now. Nonetheless, there's bits and pieces, and so this COP just announced a commitment to land restoration and to reforestation, which is something that we can look at in an African context. And some of the elites, like Jeff Bezos, has just announced he's going to put a couple billion into landscape restoration in Africa. So I think all of us are trying to figure out how to get his WhatsApp number and go after it. But there's at least a focus now on the nature-based connectivity to the climate agenda. So it's not all just a technical issue. It's about how we manage our planet. And I think, if anything, coming out of Glasgow is a bit of a realization of that. Of course, the geopolitics are complicated. The Chinese aren't really at the table in Glasgow, but they're hosting the next CBD COP. So we'll see how that plays out with the politics of it. But nonetheless, all of them, the issues on the ground. And as you say, how to look at the landscapes, how to work with them, making them more productive, and so on. And the experiences in Namibia are very, very interesting, as you say. Lots of use. The fisheries is very important. And one of the other parts of the wildlife economy that we probably I won't address here, but we should, is marine fisheries as well, not just our terrestrial fisheries, but South Africa, except for Fort Victor, South Africa, who is a Zimbabwean, Dowdy in Kenya, Agnes in Namibia, marine fisheries are a key part of our wildlife economy as well. Well, let me move on to the next panelist and get a view from a little bit further to the east. And Victor, over to you. You're sitting in Gabs, I believe, at the moment, and just back from Kigali. So welcome back home. And your comments about where the values, even building off of what Angus said about cultural and local values and the values that we face and how they relate to opportunities in the wildlife economy. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you so much.
We're losing you, Victor. Now they're a little bit loose. You might have to go to your computer.
Just give me a minute. Sorted.
Let's see if that works.
Can you hear me?
Now you're really loud, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Links, you know, it's so emotional and really great to talk about the wildlife economy. And considering what has just happened with COVID, a lot has happened and has affected a lot of businesses for people, not only in conservation, but general businesses. And I think it is time for us to really start to think about better ways in which we can build back better and stronger in a more inclusive and sustainable way. Like you said, Frank, my experiences in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, and now being in Botswana, shapes the way I look at things and my perspective on biodiversity economy, wildlife economy in general. First of all, I want to possibly frame my conversation or my talk around issues to do with values and perspectives from a Pan-African perspective. And then secondly, I want also to talk about issues that relates to land-tenure systems and governance. And then I'll wrap it up by looking at issues to do with policy. And so those are the three things that I'm going to center on. So number one, you will notice that in Africa or in Southern Africa, people have different values when it comes to wildlife. There are people who believe that wildlife has deep ancestral roots in most African people and are linked to wildlife. And therefore, the ideal system is that people want to conserve wildlife because they are linked to it from traditionally. So that's number one. We can conserve because we are linked to wildlife. It makes us who we are. And that's why there is the notion of totemism, and people believe in those things, and people conserve. And also at the same time, the value systems would then differ when people have more exposure and are socialized into a different society or culture, where you now start to see people talking about vegetarianism or veganism, and people talking about not eating meat or not wanting to eat wildlife on the basis, again, of value systems, and wanting to bring a narrative that it is unethical to kill wildlife or to eat or to feed on wildlife, whilst they feed on chickens, goats, and cattle. And so that's another value system that we're beginning to see creeping into the conversation and the ideology around wildlife economy and our ability to move forward. So we need to relook at the value system and look into these issues with with a different perspective altogether. How can we change the way we look at things as Africans? Is the narrative that we are not supposed to eat meat right? Is it African? And is it right for someone to tell you that you're not supposed to eat meat? So that's one. And that has a negative impact on the wildlife economy, especially if that narrative is pushed or framed that way on media. And then secondly, there is the notion again when it comes to belief systems and values. People think that the wildlife economy is centered upon hunting alone, and which is not correct. And the recently published The State of the Wildlife Economy by the School of Wildlife Conservation, ALU, by Dr. Suman and team, really clearly outlines the big five, or the key things that people can consider and look at when we are talking about the wildlife economy. But hunting itself is not toppling on those things. So when we are talking about the wildlife economy, we must be looking at the bigger picture beyond the hunting itself. So people should not think about hunting whenever we start to talk about the wildlife economy or biodiversity economy. People should actually be looking at how best can we diversify the opportunities that we have to benefit from nature. Things like ecotourism, things like carbon offsets, things like fisheries, things like non-timber forestry products, things like bioprospecting. So that's the broad scope or the broad array of opportunities that are there. And so that even when we are faced with trade bans or hunting bans and these movements that are coming in now, we need not to lose focus. We need to be focused and look at the opportunities and the diversity of opportunities that the wildlife economy provides for us, and move forward to ensure that it is inclusive and it is sustainable at the same time. And so that's about the value systems and my way of thinking and looking at it. How best can African countries move forward? Let us not focus on one aspect. Let us diversify and be broad in the way in which we look at things. And then number two, coming from Zimbabwe, I think most of you will understand, the challenges that Zimbabwe has gone through or has been through over the years. You notice that in the 1990s, Zimbabwe in Southern Africa was tops when it comes to conservation and issues to do with the wildlife economy. Though at that time, people were looking at the economics of wildlife and not this narrative of wildlife economy. They were just talking about the economics of wildlife and how can we make money from wildlife. But at the time, you will notice that based on the land tenure system in Zimbabwe, you would find that the public land system, which consists of your protected areas, especially the category 6, your safari areas where you can do sustainable use, consists of 12.7%, right, of the land that was under conservation where people could actually benefit. And if you add the forestry land or gazetted land, an additional 1.1%, that will then give you about 13.8% under public sector that is managed by either the Parks and Wildlife Authority of Zimbabwe or the Forestry Commission of Zimbabwe, and where people could actually benefit. And then you then look at the private sector, where you have your large commercial farms, where people actually were moving and investing in conservation and making money out of conservation. And again, it was mostly towards two things: hunting, and secondly, photographic safari, and then a little bit of it, game meat or venison, biltong and other, or fresh meat. Those were your large commercial farms, which most of them were converted into conservancies. If you look at the southeast Lowveld of Zim, you had these vast pieces of land that were used for those things. And then finally, you have the communal areas, which are districts, given appropriate authority by the government through a local government to use and benefit from wildlife through campfire program. But again, when you look at that, the devolution was not complete, and therefore you have about 5% of this land that is managed by these rural district councils with devolution, which is partial, right? People can only get money from hunting, not much developed. So that's a historical perspective that I can give about Zimbabwe and how people used to view and look at wildlife. But a decade, fast forward a decade and 3 years. So we're looking at 2003 and 2004, the land fast-track land reform in 2000, and followed by a wildlife-based land reform in 2003, 2004, destroyed everything. And so you're looking at now a country that used to be so advanced when it comes to trying to utilize and make use of wildlife. And because of policy issues and some policy inconsistencies, we have seen an industry crashing. Right, so we can no longer talk about those vast, large commercial game farms that we used to have, that were into game farming, producing a lot of meat, lots of photographic safaris, people benefiting from that. All that is gone. Very few remain. The conservancies, not all of them still stand. There are very few conservancies now. I think most of you understand the Sano Valley Conservancy, the conflicts and the challenges that they have been facing for the past decade. A lot has happened. You have isolated cases of places where you still find people still going forward and standing firm when it comes to that. And again, I say and I repeat, these issues relates to issues to do with the macro policy environment in the country. And so beyond Zimbabwe, I think this might also relate to other countries, that beyond Zimbabwe, issues that relates to policy need to be looked at with a closer lens, because they can affect the wildlife economy if we are not careful. Because you want policy consistency, you want to make sure that people have confidence in a certain environment to invest. So if a wildlife economy is to forge ahead and move forward, people need to feel safe. No one would want to invest in an area or in a country that is not safe. And so therefore that is very, very important. I just want to wrap up my remarks by saying that post the wildlife economy symposium that was held in 2019 VIFOS, not much has been happening about the wildlife economy in Zimbabwe. But I'm glad to say that last month, Zimbabwe launched or had its first inception meeting on the biodiversity economy, which is being spearheaded by African Wildlife Foundation, working with two other partners, Zela and Anchor Environment, and some experts in Zim. And I'm hoping and looking forward that something good will come out of that. But more importantly, it is not about the state of the biodiversity economy, but ideally, I'm looking forward to seeing a very strong recommendation on issues that relates to the governance, issues that relates to the policy issues, and also matters that relates to incentives. How can we incentivize people to conserve? How can we incentivize people to run with the narrative or to run with the concept of the wildlife economy and benefit from it? And I would like to comment a little bit from what Mayatula said, that one wants to be a player and a ref at the same time. Those are issues to do with governance, and we need also to look at that and talk about those issues as well. Thank you very much, friend.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the sound, everybody, but you know how it is with Zoom. You were there, but loud, a bit loud. So we certainly weren't going to miss what you had to say, Victor. Thank you. A couple points that, building off of Angus about the productivity of the landscape, Victor, then you're emphasizing that we have to also look at the diversity of things we can do on the landscape. You mentioned carbon credits, tourism, ecotourism, hunting, and so on. And that's, I think, a very interesting part of the discussion is the wildlife economy is a mixed goods and services economy with a number of different products that it can offer, which is really, really great. What do you call it? The bigger challenge, as you say, is that the wildlife economy is actually part of the economy. It's part of the whole national economy. And so if the national economy's got problems, if it's got policy problems, if it's got structural problems, it affects the wildlife economy as well. And so understanding how the wildlife economy is a piece of a national economy, where it fits in, what needs to be done to facilitate it, to enable it, to provide the right incentives is really, really critical. And then that brings, as you brought at the end, it brings us back to Nokabela's discussion about the government as a regulator, or is it a player? What's the governance? What's the structure, and so on? And as I think, as we've seen, in your case that you brought out, Zimbabwe was maybe doing better in the past than it is doing right now, but you're arguing it could come back. In the case of Namibia, it seems to be doing relatively well, but we can always do better. And so I think another challenge is that every country's at a sort of different stage in this. Some countries are fairly developed and now are trying to figure out how to scale up. Some are into restoration and rebuilding their economies and so on. So that's very, very interesting. Dowdy, are you there? Dowdy disappeared for a bit because of internet, but he's back, I think. Dowdy, do you have can we get your camera on? And I think he's there. You're on mute if you're there. And oh, there you are. Now I can see you, but can't hear you.
Okay, I'm here.
Oh, there, Dowdy's back. Okay. So, Victor had mentioned the State of the Wildlife Economy report in Dowdy's that came up from the African Leadership University, and Dowdy's one of the main writers of that report. So Dowdy's been also been working on this whole topic in a Kenyan context quite intensively over the last few months. So your perspective from Kenya on where we are with the wildlife economy, how it relates to values in Kenya, and what are the prospects? Over to you, Dowdy.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you everyone else for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Kenya is, long known for wildlife conservation and has developed different strands within the wildlife economy to, help capture value from what resources that Kenya has across. But to just give you some background is, the protected areas and wildlife areas in Kenya cover about 8%. But we have noticed over a long period of time that there has always been a mismatch between the area covered by protected areas and the actual wildlife areas. And over the years, that led to the recognition that for wildlife that is outside protected areas, we need to build protective systems that provide benefits for local communities, especially, and other landowners to incentivize wildlife economy activities and to incentivize conservation outside of protected areas. About 70% of Kenya's wildlife lies outside protected areas. And so over the past few years, we've seen the emergence of the conservancy movement, which now covers 11% of all the land in Kenya and provides very interesting protection for corridor and dispersal areas in Kenya. I think that going forward, the future of wildlife conservation will actually lie in the viability of these conservancies. If they function well, we will see wildlife conservation thrive in Kenya. If they don't, I'm sorry that we will be left with protected areas that are isolated and with very few species. You may have read from the literature that over the years, Kenya has lost 68% of its wildlife, its mammals over 2.5 kilograms within protected areas. And so if we don't make conservancies to work for wildlife and for people through wildlife economy options, I think the economic system for Kenya will be largely broken. Now, when you look at the spectrum for Kenya, in terms of the wildlife economy activities, Kenya is predominantly a non-consumptive space for utilization, non-consumptive. We do not have hunting and we do not have many other sustainable consumption activities we mainly focus on non-consumptive. And non-consumptive narrow down, I think, some of the options that are available to us as Kenyan conservationists. But just to pick a few, I would say tourism is the main one. 2 million tourists every year before COVID, and making about 1.54 billion in receipts from tourism and employing about 1.6 million people. But now we've lost almost 60 to 75% of that value as a result of COVID. We're trying to build back better. Government has provided stimulus support for the tourism industry to build back better. Other NGOs and other people have stepped in to try and help to revive tourism. But we already see the difficulties of focusing on a single sector, tourism as a driver of value for the wildlife economy. But we think that with the efforts that government has put in place, which is commendable, we will see a building back better that may be more beneficial. Fisheries is a space in Kenya that is particularly underutilized. If you look at marine fisheries, Kenya has a long coastline, but only 20,000 metric tons are harvested every year from marine fisheries, which are valued at about $40 million. And Kenya could do great, because when you look at what is lost through illegal and unregulated fishing, which is 100 million, you already see the gap and the potential for Kenya to expand marine fisheries is great. The problem we have now is that fishery is very artisanal, and we don't have a coherent fishing industry with more than enough boats that can go into the deep waters of the exclusive economic zone, where really value can be tapped in a big way. The other one that we are seeing emerging is the carbon finance. Currently, we have about 15 red programs that are capturing value from international markets for carbon projects in Kenya, but we think that there's scope to do a little bit more in this particular area. Non-timber forests, similarly, have a lot of potential in this country, but we are very restrained. A lot of the non-timber forest products are traded in informal markets, and therefore we do not have data to help us understand the magnitude of the contribution of non-timber forest products, either to household incomes or to the national economy. But we think that some of the data that we are seeing tells us that there can be significant contribution from this particular area. And then, of course, there are others like wildlife photography. I think Victor did point out that in many countries, people tend to focus the wildlife economy only on how the large charismatic mammals are used. In Kenya, we try to broaden the definition and the application of wildlife economy beyond the charismatic mammals and tourism, and begin to look at other interesting initiatives, whether it be wildlife estates, whether it will be bioprospecting, where the framework has now been well articulated through the Nagoya Protocol. We're beginning to look at climate finance. We're beginning to look at marine fisheries, like I spoke about. I think the scope for wildlife economy in Kenya, people realize now that the scope is much wider than the traditional focus on large charismatic mammals via ecotourism and tourism. But let me now turn to just a few issues. I already said that the potential for the wildlife economy in Kenya is very high, but this is unexploited. Victor did point out a few structural macroeconomic issues that hinder the exploitation in Zimbabwe. I think that is the case also for Kenya. We see that the current wildlife economy system in Kenya it needs improvement. It's broken in some sense, needs improvement. And we've been working on a lot of initiatives. I think Frank and myself and others, we've been looking at dialogues with government to try and bring some of these issues to the fore, with a view to reforming the legal and the legislative environment to provide that enabling environment for Kenya. Kenya has the opportunity to now review its wildlife law. I think the policy has come out, which is, in my view, progressive and covers a lot of the issues we are discussing here today. But the task that we have at hand now is how we translate that policy into legal reform that captures many of these issues and provides for the expansion and diversification of the wildlife economy options in Kenya. But I think I'll pick out just a couple of issues that I think that we hold us back and we need to address them. The first one is just the wildlife use rights. You know, in Kenya, wildlife is owned by the state, and the state does delegate some use rights to local communities and private owners to manage wildlife on its behalf. And wildlife is devolved, those rights are devolved at different levels, at the devolved government level, at landowner level, to some extent. But government, again, is both the referee and the user of wildlife. You know, so we're playing a very conflicting role. I think that was already mentioned by the first speaker. We need to be looking at how we reform the use rights in Kenya to work for the wildlife economy. In Kenya, we run open systems, so there are no fences, and there are implications for how you allocate use rights. Because then, if wildlife is mobile, you know, who is owning the wildlife at a certain particular point in time? And how do we even deal with those use rights across different landscapes? The other issue with use rights is how to match use rights with responsibility, because rights must go with responsibility, and especially for local communities who now have conservancies and would like to be given more strong wildlife use rights for the use of wildlife. Now, what responsibility are they understanding they should take, and do they have the capacity to play out their responsibility? These are the things we're looking at. How do we improve the capacity of local communities and private landowners who are agitating for improved wildlife use rights so that they can play their role as they should? The second thing is just the whole issue of diversification. You know, there are, like we've rightly said, there are very many opportunities for diversifying the wildlife economy from where we sit here in Kenya. But bringing it all together is problematic because of the intersectoral inefficiencies in how the wildlife economy is managed. You know, so there's the fisheries department, there's the Ministry of Agriculture, you know, there's the Ministry of Tourism, there's the Ministry of Environment. There's too many players involved, all of whom are not coordinating to help us build a coherent legal framework that furthers the diversification of wildlife economy. So this is something to look at, intersectoral alignment and coordination to ensure that, you know, the wildlife economy options that are developed or diversified are supported more coherently by government to give the value that we are looking at in different places. I mean, we see this in say marine world. So there are certain aspects of the marine economy that are managed by Kenya Wildlife Service, others managed by the Ministry of Agriculture, Department of Fisheries, others managed by the Ministry of Economic Planning in the exclusive economic zones. But these are hardly talking to each other, and that really does sabotage the efforts of the country to build a more coherent and diversified wildlife economy. I think then, lastly, there are Kenya sits at the debate many times, very strong debate of the use, non-use. You know, there are a lot of benefits that could come to Kenya from the use debate, you know, whether it's hunting, whether it's wildlife trade and things like those. But our position has always been very strongly anti-use, you know, always focusing a lot more on the non-consumptive uses, you know, and not the consumptive use. And I think that this is one area that we might want to look at. You know, if we have shut the door on hunting and other forms of use, yes, that's okay. But we should then build up other diversified, uses so that we position the country to benefit more holistically from the resources that exist in this country, because those are many. So, Frank, let me stop there for now, and you know, look to any questions or, you know, any other further comments that may come through. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dowdy. Really, really interesting. It's very interesting, this terms use and non-use. One of the comments in there by Richard Ferguson from the Southern African Wildlife College, they don't like the term there. They don't talk about non-consumptive. And they use the term responsible use, which goes back to your line about rights and responsibility, which is an important nexus. It's one thing to give rights, but the rights have to be associated with responsibility over the resource. And even now in Kenya, if all the rights are with Kenya Wildlife Service over wildlife, are they even capable of being responsible over the whole landscape? So it's one thing to say they've got control at the national level, but do they have the means to actually do that? It's the cost of regulating and managing the entire country's wildlife estate is not easy. It's almost like they can't even be resourced enough to do that. It's tough enough just to run the parks. So for South Africans, you could imagine if Sand Parks not only ran Sand Parks and the parks in Natal, but also owned all the wildlife in the whole country and controlled it all. It's very hard for them to would be very hard for them to do that. It's a very big task. And so the right responsibility in getting that right is important. The other thing that you pointed out that goes back to Ankabela is the policy coherence between the different divisions and ministries of government. South Africa likes to talk about I've heard 9+2 problem, 9 provinces, plus the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, plus the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, or whatever it's called at the moment. So 2 ministries, if you will, and 9 provinces. But you also brought out the coastal, the fisheries and the marine. And then you're sitting near Lake Victoria. You've got the aquatic, the freshwater fisheries, which is another big issue. And getting that aligned is really, really important. So an interesting thing in SA is that the Department of Environment now has forestry and fisheries inside of it. And the environment bit has been more the sort of your charismatic wildlife bits, and the forestry and fisheries have been managed more like a productive sector. And so that's an interesting development. And who knows, maybe that's something to look at too, how one brings the wildlife sectors of government together so that they can align their policies, their regulatory framework, and so on. So it's one thing to say government should regulate and not be players, but even the regulation's tough. It's not an easy thing to sort out. So we've got a whole lot of questions, everybody. Now, how do we go through these? Let me see. The one I just sort of answered for Richard was about the term non-consumptive use. There's been some discussion back and forth on predictability of land. So let me just start with Andrew on something positive. He asks Angus, Namibia has a very strong environmental constraints, yet it's doing relatively well. Why do you think this is the case? So Angus, what's working in Namibia?
Yeah, thank you. And that's quite a nice question. So really, the point in Namibia is the picture behind me was chosen for a reason. Of course, that's not representative of the entire country, but it's representative of 2 things. Firstly, Namibia is a dry country, but more importantly than that, Namibia has fantastically useless soils. And soils are the basis of production. So the wildlife economy has a competitive advantage in Namibia when we're looking at the situation that we have, and that is the basic reason why Namibia is getting ahead. But it's also it gives other countries an idea of what to look at, because if we can continue to develop the wildlife economy, we can build in more resilience. And remember that this wildlife economy doesn't occur in the absence of agriculture, it occurs with agriculture. We're not talking about exclusive wildlife areas, we're talking about embedded wildlife areas.
Okay, exclusive, or is it agriculture? I mean, there's in the Wildlife Act of Kenya, Angus, they actually have, this is the 2013 Act, it's under review now. And part of what Dowdy's been involved with and I've been involved with and so on is discussions where do they go next. It says that while game farming and game ranching in the Act should be managed as agricultural activities. So you look at that and you go, from putting on a conservation hat, so you can see, well intended, but that's a big statement to say manage game farms as an agricultural activity. Are we going to end up with canned line?
No. Sorry, let me restate that. These wildlife activities, most of them are taking place in mixed-use areas that include agriculture. They are not divorced from agriculture. Yeah. So I think that is we mustn't view it as exclusively agricultural areas. Only less than less than 18% or 15% of the land is exclusively wildlife.
Okay. Yeah, no, you're right. And it's that mixed use. It's the landscape use of which some of it is more wild and some of it is more agriculture. And
Correct.
but there, yeah. And then, but there is that interface then between how our governments provide an enabling environment for the agricultural sector vis-a-vis how they provide an enabling environment for wildlife and how that interfaces. So there's work to be done there, for sure. Which brings me, Nokabela, there's a couple questions that came early on when you spoke about this whole role of the government as a regulator or a player, and you talked about it should be more of a regulator than a player, and Luis comes in and talks about that, but Andy then comes in and says, what about government as facilitator? Should it be an active enabler and not just a regulator? What do you see?
My view on that one, thanks for the question, Andy, is that government should certainly facilitate to the extent that it can. For example, there's a lot of that we're beginning to see in South Africa now. There's a lot of stimulus packages that is being directed at the industry. And there's a lot of sensitivity towards the transformation dynamics to say that a lot of those resources must be prioritized towards women, for example. If you look at COVID, the understanding is that women have been the worst affected as nurturers, as mothers, as business people. And government has come out with a proclamation that 40% of all government procurement should be for women-owned businesses. So that definitely does help from a facilitating role point of view. To the extent that government would step back, or the extent that government would step back would depend on how disciplined that particular industry is, which means the private sector has got a duty to self-police, self-regulate, to give the comfort that the government needs, that they are responsible participants. So of course that will always be a very difficult balance. But there are a lot of systems that are coming up from the private sector side, for instance, to assist with the permitting and so on and so forth, because of the capacity issues from government. So yes, facilitating by all means. Lots of money is being thrown now. The private sector is also beginning to assist with the sharing or distribution of information. I think Victor spoke about access to information, for example. In the private sector, since COVID, so many platforms have been put together. There's the BRICS Working Committee, there is the economies, the Women's Economic Assembly in South Africa, where people support each other and share all kinds of information that is available for people to fix their businesses. So that is beginning to happen now as a consequence, or rather one of the strategies for our recovery. From a participating or point of view, it's difficult because government will never fully or entirely understand the nuances of running and operating a business. And to the extent that it needs to set policy, you must just be cautious as to how much dictation on the implementation or what relationships it must take between shareholders or owners of businesses to try and drive transformation.
Okay. Comments from anybody, other panel members on the role of the state as a facilitator or as a regulator?
Yes, friend. I was just writing a comment to say that, yes, a government's role is to play the facilitator role and creating an enabling environment for businesses to thrive, whatever type of business to thrive, and not for the government to become a player. Because if government or a government institution or an authority plays the role of a regulator and a player itself, that is not good governance, because there is a lot of conflict of interest that then comes to into play. It is very difficult for a player to be a regulator at the same time. And so my submission is that government should stick to its regulatory role and ensure that it enacts and put forward policies or guidelines or laws that enable people to thrive in business, allows people to see the value in investing in a certain sector, and in this case, the biodiversity economy. Any aspect of this sector, be it in bioprospecting, be it in non-timber forestry products, be it in carbon offsets, be it in hunting, be any sector, as long as that environment is enabling, the businesses would boom. But if a government then tries to also become a player, there will be a lot of problems. We have seen it, and we are seeing it happen every day. And so it is important that we clearly define the role of government unless there is conflation of interest. Thank you.
Okay. I could open up a can of worms, Victor, but I'll just mention something, but I don't think we'll have time on this session. We'll go for about another 10 minutes, by the way, everybody, and then then we can have a coffee break. The government is a player in our sector, the wildlife sector, because they're a major landowner and they own the park systems. They own Etosha. They own, Wange. They own, the Masai Mara, right? That's at the council level. They own Tsavo. They own Kruger, what have you. And so they actually both regulate and are land managers. And one of the things that did sort of come out of the high-level panel report, which was interesting, I don't think it's resolved at all, is what is the role of the protected area state in all of this? So, Dowdy, I think you were right to say conservancies are like critical for the wildlife survival in the continent. Angus talks about the role of community and private lands in Namibia and so on. But is the wildlife economy in protected areas is another area that we may want to look at. To what extent does the state own the land, but then, if you will, lease out the economy or bring people in like they do with the tourist sector and so on? So it's something to think about. Is there a role for communities to run parks, a role for a private sector to run parks? We see African parks as a model, but it's still running the parks sort of as traditional parks like we have elsewhere, maybe running them a bit more effectively. But is the wildlife economy only going to be something we do outside of the protected area state, or is the protected area state potentially a key part of the wildlife economy? And like Victor, like Dowdy talked about, being more diversified and not just focused on photographic tourism, but other uses, carbon, fish, whatever. Dowdy, comment from you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think that you're right, Frank, that the government is a huge owner of protected area state, and the society feels that it must manage its own assets. I think when you look at the history of economies, you will see that there was mixed economies where government had state-based enterprises that ran assets of government. Whether that was efficient or not, that's a different story. But I'm more in favor of government being bold to move towards the other side of the pendulum, where it puts in the right regulation, the right enabling environment to allow others to come and manage its assets, more productively and efficiently. I think that the experiment with the African parks is a good start, but it doesn't go far enough. Government has always, farmed out things like tourism to some degree, but kept some control. If government were bold enough to provide the right enabling environment, right restrictions, right incentives, and allow private sector to come in and manage wildlife, I think that wildlife will look different in Africa, and protected areas will look different in Africa, because the motivation for private sector to create value would translate, in my view, to great efficiencies in conservation and other aspects of conservation. So I think that what we need to look for is adventurous government that can set the example across the African government by setting that enabling environment that farms up wildlife use or wildlife economy options beyond tourism, beyond tourism. Even tourism now, it's very prescripted what you can do. For example, you can build a camp but you can only view wildlife between 6 and 6 p.m. You know, what about night game drives? What about these other more innovative things that respond to the whole range of customer experience needs today? People have been coming to parks since 1900, doing the same thing. I mean, I think people are looking for a different experience in parks, which today's parks are not providing. And I think government needs to be more adventurous. So yeah, I would think for me, you know, government needs to be adventurous to set the right tone, which has a balance between, you know, the conservation or the sustainable conservation of the resource and its use, and you know, driving value via private sector, so that we may see the full benefits from protected areas. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So that's another piece of the discussion that is not just rights and responsibilities and opportunities in community areas and in private areas, but also in public areas, and where we might be able to build economic opportunities and improve livelihoods through a more economic management of public estates. The last question I want to just touch on is different. Both Angus and Victor talked a bit about meat and about the amount of wild meat and fisheries. Angus talked about, Dowdy talked about fisheries too, and Victor talked about the cultural aspects of consumption of meat, and is this part of heritage and so on. It seems that a lot of the wildlife economy at Kenya is maybe the most extreme example, Dowdy, has focused on sort of animals for recreation, that we have them around so we enjoy looking at them, which is perfectly fine. But putting wildlife into food security, putting wildlife into nutrition, putting wildlife into health and so on seems to me to be an opportunity. A couple of the commentators, Yvette has talked about this a bit. I'm wondering whether or not we should stop consuming domesticated animals. I'm sort of in that camp. I prefer venison, but there you go. I'm looking at my other screen. That's why my eyes keep bouncing around. Ranja also asks about this issue, and I think there's a question: to what extent can the wildlife economy deliver other livelihood values besides recreation, or in addition to, not besides? And one of this, it would seem to be, is nutrition. Is it realistic? Let me ask Angus first, because you are probably the most developed wildlife meat sector, and then we could ask Nokabena from South Africa. Is this a model of looking at managing landscapes for protein as well as managing them for recreation? Angus?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, the main point is that we should be opening up the economy. And to pick up from Dowdy, government should be focusing more on the regulatory environment and stop being an active player, so that they can work out the means to open up the economy so that it can provide multiple benefits. Meat is only one of those benefits. You talk of recreation in Kenya. Remember, most of that recreation, as I said in my earlier statements, is focused on a Western or a tourism market, incoming tourism market. It's not necessarily focused on internal well-being and recreation of having wildlife around. So the answer is very much yes, open up the market. And Andy made the point and asked a question around morals and people imposing morals. Again, I would say open the market. If people want to have a moralistic high ground, then let them buy the trophy animals, remove them from the land, and have them somewhere else. Pay the price. Open the hunting market so that animal rights activists can take their wildlife off the land and look after it somewhere else, assuming that the rules are set correctly, that rhino or elephant or whatever will enjoy the same welfare as it would have if it had otherwise stayed alive on the piece of land. So I think that we should be opening markets. I think we should be giving choices, but they need to be bound by rules.
Okay, good. And Nokabela?
Absolutely, I agree with Angus. In South Africa, there is a huge scope or opportunity from the meat production side of wildlife as a contributor. One, from a health point of view, game meat is supposedly slightly healthier. And secondly, processing all the other opportunities down the value chain, what you make of whatever is left out of your if it was trophy hunting. So we make sure that nothing goes to waste. So many streams of revenue are generated out of the different parts of the animal. So my point is, I agree entirely. It's a huge scope, and often though government does interfere, I would like to say they think they're intervening, but they interfere in terms of how it should be processed, where and by whom. And to that extent, government or sort of the industry becomes a little bit unhappy.
Interesting. The meat, and it's we're because we use wildlife, we often think about mammals, but of course there's the whole flora and plant and food side of things too, and teas and medicinals and what have you that we need to scratch. And I think Dottie also made that point that it's a big economy out there. There's the fishery side, the timber, non-timber, the timber side, and so on. And we've had a lot of other good questions come in. I don't know how to attack all of them at once. There's a huge group of questions. Let me see if I can, which one should I pick? What do you guys, there's one that keeps popping up, Dowdy, and I don't know if you want to go into it, but because a lot of the folks in the call from Southern Africa is why don't you guys hunt?
Okay, I thought that would be asked. Let me remind people that Kenya is the historical home of safari hunting. You know, if you read the chronicles of the British and the extravagant Americans, you will find that Kenya is really home of safari hunting. But Kenya stopped hunting for good reasons. Over the years, hunting was not well managed. There was indiscriminate killing of all sorts of wildlife, and that led to huge population declines without corresponding increase in value to the people that lived with the land. So hunting wasn't very well organized. So in 1979, the government took the decision to ban hunting, most importantly, to allow populations to recover, because some populations had been hunted beyond threshold levels for recovery. Governments put a stop to help provide space for that, for populations to recover. Since then, populations haven't recovered fast enough. But the experience with the hunting industry, I think left a sour taste in the mouth of the government of Kenya. And people have been unable to return to a place where they can entertain hunting. There was a huge safari hunting related industry in Kenya before 1999. For example, in terms of taxidermy, many of you may have heard of Zimmerman. And Zimmerman was the second largest taxidermy industry in the whole world. And it was based here in Nairobi. And so, you can see that by banning hunting, of course, Kenya did lose lots. But that decision was made to protect what was remaining of various types of species that were under particular danger from extended hunting. So we hope that one day, maybe in another generation, when the species have recovered and maybe more adventurous people have come on, maybe hunting may be reintroduced. But by now, the policy prescription is that there shall be no hunting in Kenya. I hope that explains it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dowdy. But they do fish, and they do trophy fishing. So you can go on and sport fish in Kenya.
Yeah, yes, we big in trophy fishing.
So if the wildlife swims, you can go after it. But if
also you can come and hunt birds too, so that's fine.
And you can hunt birds, so it's quite an interesting. So there's two bits of your wildlife economy value system. There is, as you just said, a strong belief still in the country that hunting isn't the way we want to go. And also, you had mentioned earlier, another really important one from a Southern African perspective is a strong resistance to fencing, that wanting to keep the landscapes open. And in fact, one of the discussions in Southern Africa is how to get some of those fences down, and how to open up conservancies like they've done next to Kruger. So you've got some interesting underlying values. And can you build a wildlife economy without fences and without hunting? And the discussions in Kenya as well, they're going to try. Yeah, let's go for it. Angus, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I did briefly. Just to add that, Dowdy, my discussions, and please correct me if I'm wrong, with some of the Conservancy members from Kenya on the hunting topic is they're not necessarily against opening up hunting per se, but they want to understand very clearly the governance that's going to go behind it. They don't want to see another form of elite capture happening with hunting. So for now, they're very, very reserved because they don't have a faith that they will be empowered to undertake that hunting when if and when it might come.
Yeah, Angus, you're correct. And you remember I said that the hunting that happened those days really did not provide any benefits to local communities who owned some of the places where hunting happened. So yes, governance is a big one for caution, especially among community conservancies.
And I might mention too, Angus, you just used the term elite capture. The discussion in South Africa about transformation is a very South African discussion, but around the continent, it's about elite capture, which is a similar issue of some people have got the power and other people are excluded. And so another big discussion that we have had in Kenya is how can you open up a wildlife economy where it's not just for the rich guys, and you don't have elite capture. So that is another dimension. Ian's asked, I've just got a message. We can go a little bit longer, folks. And so I can go to about 1:45 before we should actually take a break. So hang with us. It's great that you're attending. It's really, really interesting. Ian Rushworth has asked a couple of points that I'd like to bring up with you. One is about exports, but the first one, and I'll come back to that, about the export market. He talks about venison, but exports in general, international trade and the wildlife economy. I'll come back to that one. But before I do that, I think an interesting question, especially for scientists, is if we open up and diversify the wildlife economy, how do we know if we're doing the right thing, if it's working? What's our metrics? How do we know? Is it jobs? Is it money? Is it landscape? Is it number of animals? So from your perspective, how would you judge whether a wildlife economy program was successful? Start with Victor. You're a scientist. How do you measure the success of or the failure of a wildlife economy program?
Thanks, Frank. I'll start by talking as a scientist. The first matrix that you'd want to look at is sustainability. And for us to measure and see that we are doing things right, it means that if we are utilizing the animals, we want to see healthy populations. Not just the population itself, but also that the animals behavior is not affected. Mind you, prior to COVID, there were concerns in the ecotourism sector that I think the tourism industry is not sustainable. That's why people talk about responsible tourism and trying to limit the number of people who visit some of the parks. That's why somebody, I think Richardson was talking about non-consumptive versus responsible tourism, because sometimes people visiting actually affect animals a lot in terms of stress, in terms of behavior. A whole lot of things happen ecologically. And so one of the metrics or the measure is to look at a healthy population. Is the population growing? Is it reproducing? Is everything okay? That's from an ecological perspective. And then secondly, that's also relates to fisheries in lakes or rivers or in dams. And then secondly, from an economic perspective, one matrix would be to look at aspect of inclusion. It should be inclusive. I think Agnes talked about elite capture, which is a big problem at the moment. So we would want to see the inclusion of other people, the inclusion of local people, the inclusion of the general populace. And so we can actually measure that. To what extent are people being involved? To what extent are people benefiting from these initiatives? So that's the second aspect, to looking at the economics, a bit of it, and looking at in terms of, local livelihoods, are they improving or not? So we can measure that. And then the third one would also now to look at the contribution to the GDP. To what extent are we contributing in terms of business? Because if we are investing it and if we are developing it to be a sustainable sector, And then it means that we ought to be able to measure our contribution to the GDP of a country and then look at it, Africa as a whole. To what extent are we performing? I would stop there.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks, Victor. Angus?
Yeah, so this is the challenge that we have, is how do we capture the embedded values in any wildlife product that we're going to sell? And Victor's unbundled a few of those values. I would argue to try and disregard, we can't disregard GDP, but we have to try and change that narrative, because GDP does not care. And GDP assumes that the more money you have, the happier you're going to be, and that there's some miraculous trickle-down effect. We know that there isn't much of a trickle-down effect, is overstated, and money doesn't lead to happiness after a certain point. So those are some of the things we have to unbundle. There's a lot out there that we can learn from. Victor talked about inclusivity. We have fair trade labels that are working towards that. They're not perfect. The carbon market is actually very exciting at the moment, much to my surprise. I hadn't looked at it for a while. I went back in and looked at it recently. And to my surprise, in the voluntary carbon market, I found that there are wildly different values. And those values are related to the pitch that the person is putting in with what they're selling. And it's all about the embedded values. Are there biodiversity values associated with this carbon? Are there community values associated with this carbon? So there are movements. The scientists have to come up with basic metrics that can capture the complexity of diversity. That's the challenge. Key species, key indicators that can convey a very simple message to the consumer: you're doing the right thing at the right time in the right place.
Cool. Kabela or Dottie, any comment?
Frank, I know that the School of Wildlife Conservation of the African Leadership University is grappling with this particular issue and currently developing an index for how you measure the success of a wildlife economy. So rather than going to what that looks like, I would just like to notify the panel and those listening that there's something cooking in the works, and the people should look out for that, because it will shed some light in how you will propose how we might measure success of wildlife economy in a particular context.
Okay, we'll watch this space.
Thank you.
No, Kabela?
And for me, I'll just link up a few of the points that have been made, which is one, if you look at employment within the sector, of course, that's related to poverty reduction or alleviation to a degree. And one hopes that that labor is productive in terms of improving your own efficiencies in managing your establishment. And more than that, I suppose the biggest factor would be from a transformation point of view, the profile of those people employed and where they are in the pecking order in a setup. And again, of course, education, and skills development will contribute towards making all of that work in total. As far as the animals themselves or the wildlife, if you look at the endangered or the protected species, when government comes in to regulate what can be hunted, what cannot be, the biggest thing that if you see the numbers improving, the slight challenge we have, which the public sector takes upon themselves, is the accurate reporting of the numbers of certain species, and to the extent that government must regulate how much can be hunted and when. So if you look at those and the balance in terms of your management plan, your degradation of the vegetation versus the number of animals you keep, that is a question of education and people knowing what they are doing in that space. So I'm just piecing together the logic that the different points have been made makes. Thanks.
Okay, fabulous, absolutely fabulous. The role of certification schemes, of standards, of being accountable, reporting systems and so on, I think are all really important for not only encouraging the wildlife economy to do better, but understanding what's working and what's not working. So you've got SAMBI working on a wildlife economy standard. The high-level panel report called for a standard on hunting. Some of this is related to the wildlife economy at the domestic level, but it's also very important for international trade. Ian Rushworth asked about lead shots for exporting venison and the problem with lead in the EU. Well, the EU doesn't want lead. They don't want lead shot coming in, but it's much more than just lead shots. It's even the whole issue of whether Africa should be exporting venison meat. Should they? I get my biltong. I live in the UK, and I get my biltong from here. I can't get it in from SA or from Zim. Why not? I should be able to, and it has nothing to do with lead. It's more complicated than that. But even under Angus, under your CBD that you talked about, we're only going in number 15 or 16. The last CBD came up with a very interesting policy guidance on the sustainable wild meat industry, but the guidance says the wild meat shouldn't even go to the cities in Africa, that the wild meat should be kept in the countryside. So they don't even want the venison to come to Johannesburg or to Windhoek or to Nairobi or to Harare. And their sort of vision is those people, which is most of the population, should be eating, I guess, chickens or vegetables or something, and that only the localized. It makes me want to say that I'm moving to the countryside. And so how do we get the trade up? Why, can we look at international trade? I would think also in an African perspective, could use your names, could Angus be selling a bit of wild meat to Nokabela, and then she could do a little bit of tourism for Namibians, and the Nokabela could buy some fish from Dowdy, and then Dowdy could actually go and do some, carbon offsets in Zimbabwe and so on. How do we get the wildlife economy internationalized on the continent? There's huge opportunities to move wildlife. There's a question about ivory and rhino horn trade. You can't even move a rhino at the moment from Zimbabwe to South Africa or vice versa. So is there an opportunity to look at the African Continental Free Trade Act and build a continental wildlife economy where different parts of the continent can specialize in different things? So maybe in Kenya we go look at the animals, and in Namibia we go and have a braai, and in South Africa we breed them up, and whatever, and so that we actually look at diversifying not just within national economies but across the continent. So final thoughts about international trade and opportunities in the wildlife economy for exports. Anybody? Nokabela?
Most definitely, Frank, we should have already by now opened up trade between African countries. We should, for that matter, be dictating the rules of engagement as far as wildlife is concerned. However, it is not like that. Truthfully, what is ethical, what is this, what is that, is dictated elsewhere. But to the extent that we are still very much bogged down with a lot of our own internal challenges, makes wildlife and these aspects take a backseat from a cooperation with other African countries. But definitely we should have been up there already. Okay.
Anybody else have a comment? Angus?
Yeah, so two points. One, I agree fully that we really should be exploring intra-Africa markets. We each have different competitive advantages that we can offer. Now I've forgotten my second point, so yeah.
That's a good first point. Dottie?
Yeah. I think that the just concluded African Free Trade Area provides a great opportunity for us to actualize what we are speaking about here. There is already a lot of regional trade happening in various wildlife products that is maybe not formalized. I can give you an example of Mopane worms. Mopane worms are a part of the wildlife economy. They flow from Zimbabwe into South Africa, into Namibia, into Botswana, as far as DRC. That's continental trade. That's intercontinental trade. And maybe for some of these that are not subject to strict international commitments and conventions, maybe that's where we should be starting. For Mopane worms, for different types of other non-timber forest products, which we already see. We know fruits, bush mangoes, flow all the way from Cameroon into the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa and coming down into Angola. And so that opportunity exists. It is for us to think about moving the discussions on trade away from what is looked as formal trade manufacturing, industry, service, and to begin to talk about how we create the platform for some of these wildlife economy products to move across borders more efficiently and formally. Tourism, for example, I know that the African Union is beginning to look at a tourism master plan for how you travel across borders. This is things that we should be looking at, because if we are able to unlock cross-border movement across Africa, coupled with flights and the cost of flights, I think people will begin to move across Africa. The biggest problem around moving in Africa is visas for fellow Africans. If we're able to sort that out, we can boost inter-African travel. And that's where I think tourism needs to be looking at as a next frontier, rather than looking for inbound tourists from Europe and from Asia and Latin America. We should be looking at these 1.3 billion Africans who are here and how we can make it easy for them to visit each other and reconnect. And I think that's where we'll build a more robust wildlife economy at the regional, at the continental level. Thank you.
Victor, final word from you, and then I'm going to have to wrap us up.
Thank you very much. One thing that I have in mind is issues to do with value addition. If our products are value added, it becomes very easy to trade cross borders. It's so easy to trade. The unfortunate thing is that most of the things with the products, they are traded as raw at the moment. But think of it that we are able to process the matembi or the mopane worms, or the fish itself, processed properly. We are able to create more value. And so the more effort we put in making sure that we value add, we beneficiate the products, we are able to actually attain more value out of it. And they are aesthetically nice and good to look at. It's easy to trade. But more importantly, what you have said, Daud, is that it's easy to go to Europe from Africa than it is to visit your next door. And that has to end. That has to be something that people should talk about and deal with decisively in the shortest possible time if Africa is to progress when it comes to tourism, when it comes to trade, and respecting ourselves as a people in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, everybody. I think we're going to have to wrap up, and it's a note that I'm very happy we're wrapping up on, international trade. It's a topic of real interest to us at the African Wildlife Economy Institute, and we're working with the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation Unit and looking at wild meat, and we launched a product on promoting wild meat for urban consumption last month in Johannesburg, and we're going to take it to Zimbabwe next. And there's no reason why mopane worms, fish, meat shouldn't be traded around the continent, plus to tourism, plus to non-timber forage products and so on. So the wildlife economies opportunities, I think, are huge across the continent. It's a huge market and a huge resource base. But final point, as was asked by Ian, we have to constantly think about how do we know we're doing the right thing. So we've got to measure it, have good metrics, have good accountability, and so on and so forth. So I think we better close the session now. I'm going to head off and let it go for now. I mean, we've got a little bit of time more, but Angus, last point you want to make?
I was just going to say that Ian has posted that we have until 11:15.
Do you guys want to carry on? Are you happy to, or do you have to get back to the office? I think we better wrap up. I think we've had a pretty good session.
I've got a question
Okay.
that I'd like to answer, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So Ronja asked a question. I need to find it now, around my little thing on livelihoods and recreation and stuff. My little rant. Whether there's any examples that are working. And any recommendations. I'm not aware of too many examples that have been formally looked at and that are working. But I'll give you two things that we are in Namibia sort of trying to play around with to understand it better. The first is rhino poaching. So in the background that I've got here, this is the northwest of Namibia, Irongo and Kunene regions of Namibia. It's extremely dry, it's extremely arid, people are living very much on the margins. This also happens to be a landscape that has some of the world's, in fact, probably the world's only really, truly free-ranging population of black rhino. They are in communal areas under custodianship agreements, and they roam freely. In the last 4 years, we've had 2 poaching incidents, and those happened pretty much on the eve of the first lockdowns and people being relieved of their jobs. Two incidents that happened in a short space of time. They caught the perpetrators. But this area has a number of rhino, and yet they are not poached. The communities earn some income from rhino, but I can assure you they would earn a hell of a lot more money if those rhino were poached, even considering the meager amounts of money that the local operators get from rhino poaching. So there's a very high incentive to poach, and yet communities are not poaching. And we're trying to understand why. Part of that is we've had a big rhino pride campaign, which has created an identity in the people that live there, that part of their landscape has these free-ranging black rhino that exist nowhere else in the world, and people identify with that. So that leads us to think that there is something that we can work with here. The second one is in our inland fisheries program. So we have a huge inland fisheries program that runs in Kaza, mainly in Namibia, but also in Zambia, Botswana, and Angola. The issue there is that these are mesotrophic rivers. They're never going to produce commercial levels of fish. And occasionally they get disrupted by 2 ephemeral lakes, Lake Liembezi and Lake Ngami in Botswana, Liembezi in Namibia, that are highly productive, suddenly create a market for fish. People come in, they earn a lot of money. At the end of the drying season, when the lakes dry up, they move onto the rivers, they obliterate the rivers, the whole thing collapses. We build up again. We've gone to these communities, and the only identification with recreational angling is, quite frankly, white people coming on boats and trying to catch tigerfish. That's the identification with recreational angling. I've personally had conversations with people sitting at the river with their rods, having a few beers with their friends, and they tell me, no, recreational angling is only for these visiting tourists. It's at the point where people are not identifying recreation as being part of what their existence is all about. So we've got a long way to go. For those that are interested, there's an organization that I haven't looked into enough, but I would encourage you to. It's an organization called RARE. They're working mostly in the marine environment, and they're working on behavioral economics, and they've got some really fascinating stuff. But if we're talking about value for conservation, this is really an area that we have to focus a lot of attention on, because it's going to lower the transaction costs and it's going to improve human well-being.
Great, fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So we do have a few more minutes. So another comment from anybody, and then we'll move again towards wrapping up.
And for mine, Frank, would be, yes, wildlife is accessible in South Africa. And the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism Agency, through the Wildlife Industry Transformation Forum, does donate game to people who have access to land, whether they own them or they are leasing them as a starter pack, and sort of other supporting services from a transportation point of view. Similarly, as the SANParks has jumped on the bandwagon to donate or loan game to people who want to participate, historically disadvantaged people. The important thing for the people is, one, to have a management program and to know what you want and speak for what you want, as opposed to accepting whatever is thrown in your direction. So that is very important for those who are keen and willing to participate in this sector. Thank you.
That's very interesting. So there was actually a supply coming from the public sector to the private sector. That's something, Dowdy, that you may look at in the Kenyan model as a possibility. Dowdy, Victor?
Sure, Frank. I just had an interesting experience in Kigali. Went to Akagira National Park, and for the first time experiencing a network between the local communities and a protected area network. Having a national park that supplies or allows a cooperative made of local communities to come and fish in the lakes in Nakagira and sell to people at a local market at a subsidized price, and have another proportion of the fish sold in Kigali at a higher price. And these communities, as a cooperative, opening up a shop in Kigali for high value. And if we are to look at models like that and add value and look at how best can protected areas now, which are close to people, and you can only leave your footprints, you take nothing, and you leave your money and your footprints, and then you go. But we have a lot of potential inside the protected areas. There's so much we can do. So I'm thinking that we need to look at many models and the potential of benefiting from these protected areas to ensure that it is inclusive and incorporate local communities so that they benefit and they feel part and parcel of the biodiversity or wildlife economy. Thank you.
Then we put Nokumbele's business hat on, Victor, and we've got the branding of, Akagira fish, local communities, storylines, and it'll end up in the Radisson Blue Hotel in Kigali selling for a packet, and everybody will feel good. No, it's there. Now, that's a fascinating story. I look forward to hearing more about that. Dowdy?
I think my last comment here is to pitch for the development of insects as a viable protein away from maybe animal protein that we all emphasize. Insects are eaten all over Africa. We know that about 6,000 species are available as food among African countries for various cultural reasons. So people eat depending on how their culture drives them. But I think that insects present a good enough business case for feeding the next population of Africans. So for a wildlife economy, option and business, I strongly endorse insects and the farming of insects to feed the ever-increasing African population. Thank you very much.
Oh my God. Well, we've certainly moved from just looking at ecotourism. Now we're into eating the bugs. And there's a heck of a lot of biomass and bugs on the continent. So there's a lot of consumption there. Can we do it responsibly? Can we measure it? Let's see. Okay, it's top of the hour, and I think we should head off. Okay, Victor, go ahead.
Just a comment. What Dowdy said is so interesting because you can farm crickets, you can make money out of them at the back of your house. And now people are doing black soldier fly production. I think now we talk of the circular economy, and black soldier fly is a game changer in animal nutrition. So you can promote poultry at a very low price because you do feeds and you also feed your livestock and things like that. So the opportunities are massive. They are great, but we need to support each other. We need to support small and medium enterprises, but that requires an enabling environment, macroeconomic environment that pushes people to do great things. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we need to start by doing exactly what we did this morning with you folks, is talk through the issues and open them up. I mean, everybody said what brain power on this call. You guys are just absolutely fabulous. And there we are, perspectives from Kenya, from Namibia, from South Africa, from Zimbabwe, and we only touched 4 of the countries on the continent. So just imagine if we can get these discussions going with Cameroon, with Ghana, with Guinea, with South Sudan. There's a huge potential, a huge know-how out there that we can work on it. Some issues common, getting the governance right, getting the regulatory framework right. Some interests will be competitors. I'll sell you my insects, but I want to buy your meat or what have you, and we trade and so on. But there's huge opportunities across the continent. And I'd like to just end by saying thank you to the organizers for allowing us to do this session. I think it's great that we're actually looking at conservation from an interdisciplinary perspective. We're bringing in business, ethics, values on top of the scientific base that we need for the economy to function and function properly. And so a big thank you to the Conservation Symposium and to our speakers. And I think let's call it a session. It was a great 2-hour call. Cheers, everybody.